your story is very interesting, and we're glad to know in advance that it has a happy ending. But why don't you start? How did you become a Navy SEAL?
Yeah, so I decided, back when I was a kid, I was never felt like a man, never felt like enough. I had like a lot of the typical stuff, right? The bullying, the self-doubt, the lack of confidence, the depression, the anxiety, a lot of things that a lot of people go through and maybe don't talk about or maybe don't acknowledge, but as I'm coming to find are more and more common. And so for me though, I decided to seek out this level of masculinity and confidence. To me, the all answers pointed towards the military, but not just anything in the military. I decided that I was going to do the absolute toughest, most challenging growth experience that I could do in the entire military.
If I may say, from from a mammalian perspective, you had to be in the one-up position,
Mm,
right? That's whatever.
absolutely. Right. And there was a lot of ego attached to that, for sure. And I decided to make that shift. And as with anything, you have to become a mentally first, right? You have to make that identity level shift before you can actually do the actions and become and get the stuff. So I sought out a mentor, and I was, if you'd seen me back in the day, I was a 120 pounds skinny kid that wore eyeliner and black pants and eye makeup and all that crazy stuff. Nothing like I look
Which was,
today.
if I may say, that was a different kind of one-up strategy, which every adolescent sort of chooses from the one-up strategies that they observe.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right. It was some way of standing out, look at me, look how different I am, right? Look how special I am. So I spent a year training with an ex-SEAL who had a CrossFit gym near my house, my parents' house, and he trained me physically, mentally, emotionally, and I got strong and I got physically able to do the training. But the real transformation there was what I did mentally, being able to challenge myself to that level and understand what it takes to get through Navy SEAL training. So I show up, go through boot camp, which to me, boot camp was the worst part of the entire experience. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this because the SEAL training part of it sucked, like which it's supposed to, but boot camp was like just is absolutely miserable. Even though it wasn't physically difficult, it was just a monotony of marching and standing around doing nothing, and folding clothes and memorizing stuff and playing these stupid games where I had to, it's just to me it was all these silly games that you had to play. But it was miserable. I hated that part more than any other piece of it. But I got through and showed up to SEAL training, got through SEAL training, went through Hell Week. And for the record now, I never actually officially became a SEAL. For that, and by that I mean I never actually got to wear the trident, the insignia, and wear the title of SEAL because uh, I got injured a couple of times going through, and then there were some hiccups along the way. But then about a month before I was supposed to go back and like finish everything out, so I was about a month or two away from being like done with it and actually getting that title. And then one night, as if this great ironic twist of life, I was out one night and I was walking across the street. I was in a crosswalk and a drunk driver blew through an intersection going 40 miles an hour and hit me while I was on foot. And my feet left the ground, and the first thing to hit was my head. And I have no memory of any of this, thank God, because
Wow.
yeah, it's not a good experience. And my next real memories are in the hospital. They're not solid memories. They're flashes, it's glimpses, it's a face, it's a scene, it's these little things. And my memory kind of starts to flicker back in. But I remember just waking up, and it felt like I was dying. It, my
Excuse me, you said dying?
dying.
Okay.
It
So
was like
was that physical pain, or you mean the thought?
it was at this time. It was physical. I didn't know. So when I woke up in the hospital, I didn't know what had happened. I had no memory of the accident. All I knew is that everything hurt and I was confused. I had no idea where I was, no idea what was going on. My perception of reality was just shattered and distorted. I knew I was supposed to be somewhere doing something, but I had no idea what. So the level of confusion was terrifying. This the way you're used to perceiving reality and perceiving life and interacting with life through your senses just scrambled, right? It's like get a bad signal on a TV, or your internet's not working, everything's scrambled, right? It was like that, but just for my perception of life. So come to find out, I learned what happened, learned I'd been hit by a car, learned I'd been in a coma for a few days. And the most devastating of all was learning that I could not actually go back and be a SEAL. due to I had brain bleeds, subdural hematoma was the medical term for it, which means I had just bleeding inside of my skull. And due to that, I couldn't go dive. I was not deployable. And, so it's kind of like my naval career was just cut short. So I committed, spent the last 3, 4 years committing myself, heart, mind, and soul to this dream of becoming a Navy SEAL. And all of a sudden, like that, it's gone. So I find myself like, what do I do? Right. So there's the physical damage, right? The physical brain damage to my frontal lobe, which personality, impulse control, emotional regulation, all the things that make us higher mammals, as you refer to it, I think it's one of your two brains, right? That was the part of my brain that took the brunt of the damage. So, I was very short tempered. I was very angry. I was very depressed. I had zero impulse control. I didn't know who I was. It was a lot of really confusing stuff. And then combine that with the loss, right? This ripping away of my identity and this everything I'd worked for. I was in a pretty bad mental place. And on top of that, I had to reteach myself how to talk and how to speak properly. I spent a lot of time in speech therapy, learning how to use words and articulate and get the words in my head out of my mouth appropriately. I had to spend time in vestibular rehab, basically relearning how to walk and balance and how to get my motor skills looking back the way. I had to spend some time getting my eyes to converge and focus properly on the same point. So there were all these physical difficulties. So you mix all that together, and I was a mess. And then there's the physical pain where, there was a period of my life where I needed opiates to just get out of bed and function in the morning. And unfortunately, I never dealt with any addiction or anything like that, but I did experience firsthand how happy the medical system is to write you a bottomless prescription for as many narcotics as you want.
Can I
And I
ask you,
remember going,
when
yeah,
you were in pain, what was the cause of the physical pain?
the most of it probably would have been the actual trauma to the brain. Because I
But
remember
the brain
it was
doesn't have nerves.
interesting. So,
Maybe
you
like
know,
neck?
it felt like there was a balloon. The best way to describe it is it felt like there was a balloon in my skull and somebody was like overinflating this. Right? If you've ever like overinflated a balloon, you kind of feel it was like that. There was like a pressure inside of my head
Wow.
expanding out.
Yeah.
It was the
There's a
worst headache. I've never had a headache like this in my life. It was
Oh,
it was yeah, and
wow.
it was a year-long headache. It's
Wow.
um
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There are membranes around the brain. And so, okay. Got it.
mm, I think I had a lot
This,
of swelling of the brain. Fortunately, the back of my skull cracked open and I believe relieved a lot of the pressure.
oh,
So
so
they
there
didn't have
was, so there was a crack. Okay. So that's, yeah. Okay. I see.
yeah, I had fractures. I don't know if you can see on camera, but I have some scars around this eye.
Okay.
I had orbital fractures, and then the back of my skull.
Okay.
There's a cool
Okay.
scar on the back of my head as well from where I
Okay. Okay.
bonked it on the
It's
concrete.
also when things heal, they're not necessarily in alignment. That's, I think, the
Yeah,
biggest. That's the yoga teacher perspective.
yep, yeah. So there was it was that, and I had some broken ribs and some bumps and some
Oh,
bruises,
okay.
but the headache was the worst of all. Right, just
Okay.
the like felt like somebody was drilling into my skull with like a power tool. It was
Oh my
just
God.
excruciatingly painful.
And tell us, oh, you'll at some point, the guy getting caught. Well, I'll put that down. Okay.
Yeah,
Who
yeah.
done it? I'll put who done it, but you can continue your story and I'm sure people are wondering.
Yeah, well, that was an interesting part of it too, right? Is because I had all this rage and this cocktail, right? Rage, anger, depression, sadness, anxiety, like they're all interrelated. Right? None of them exist in a vacuum, isolated by itself. So I had a lot of these interplaying with each other, and of course, this rage directed at this guy. Now, if you're wondering who was the guy, he was an upstanding member of society, a two-time prior felon who had just gotten out of prison for armed robbery and aggravated assault. So he wasn't even driving his own vehicle, right? I couldn't have sued him if I wanted to, which I did, but there was nothing. It's just a guy. And at the time, it's funny because at the time I had a lot of anger, to the point where I had enough military training to map out. I was plotting out how could I get this guy, right? Okay, I know where he lives. I could sit on that rooftop over there and get him when he comes out. Like I plotted this out like to the detail. Didn't execute on it. Um, and Now I've actually I've forgiven him, and ultimately really realized this has been actually very, very therapeutic for me, because holding on to anger and holding on to resentment, there's a great saying, it's attributed to the Buddha, but it's that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other guy to die.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
doesn't. So I learned, it took me many years to make peace with everything, and I'll speak to that in a little bit. But um, the longer I held on to this anger and directed it and blamed him for it, right? And yes, he's responsible for driving the vehicle and all that, but I also, I chose to be out. I chose to cross the street. Like not that it was my fault, but I'm responsible for being where I was at the time. And once I accepted my responsibility for my role in it, even though it's not, this is what I tell my clients I work with, right? It may not be your fault, but it is your responsibility. And once I made that shift and stopped blaming him, it actually, the real thing that was healing for me was actually giving him compassion and thinking to myself, not like people still need to be held responsible for their actions, of course, but recognizing that, what, a guy who's spent a lot of his life in prison and is driving blackout drunk and living this life, he has probably not had a happy life. He's probably not had some of the benefits or advantages I've had. And, while that doesn't make what he did okay, being able to see it from that perspective and just empathize and understand where people are coming from did a
Mm.
lot to help me to let go of it.
Mm.
And once I
Was he
realized that,
though, was he found held responsible for this accident though?
so he, this is funny, right? So this was also around Christmas time. So if you saw a picture, like I can your picture, a photo if you want. I was in an elf costume. I was in a goofy, we were out, I'd been out drinking, but they tested my blood alcohol levels. I was low enough. I could have legally driven a vehicle with how much alcohol was in my system at the time. He was like 3 times over the legal limit. But so we were out and about at a pub crawl. I was dressed as an elf, and so this guy is 0.24 something like that, and he hits me in the crosswalk, and I can only imagine, he's driving and everything's probably blurry, and he hits something and gets out and he sees like a bloody elf lying in the road, and I can only imagine what's going through his head. So he gets out, he looks at the scene, and he gets back in the car and takes off. Right, bolts, and he ends up ditching the car a couple blocks away. Police find the car because when it turns out when you hit a person, there's a very distinct crack that was on the windshield, and there's blood all over the car. So it was not hard for them to put two and two together. So they end up tracing, it was his dad's car. They end up finding, so they ended up finding him later, bringing him in, and charging him with 3 felonies. And fortunately, he must have had a terrible attorney, because the police botched this case every single step of the way. They didn't do enough breathalyzer. They didn't do a responsible breathalyzer test. It would have been admissible in court. They mishandled the chain of custody when it came to the blood sample that they did with him. So none of the evidence that they had would have been admissible in court. And somehow my attorney and I knew that, but his didn't. So he ended up taking a plea deal and did 36 months. Um, and at this point, like,
Uh,
I hope he's woken up and I hope he's decided to make better choices. I haven't thought about him in years. This is the first time I thought about it in a long time. It's interesting because I don't have any feelings come up either way, other than I genuinely hope he learned some stuff, took a look in the mirror, and decided to turn his life around. But I don't have any resentment
yeah.
for him. And a big piece of it for me is actually, in a lot of ways, I'm actually grateful and appreciative of everything that happened, because, not that I would have chosen for it to happen, but where I am at now in life and what I get to do as a result of these events, and because of my story and the people that I get to work with, I'm very, very grateful for it. And just in terms of clients, I got a message the other day from a client confirming that he would have killed himself if it hadn't been for the work we did together. So to date, that brings 5 people that I've helped avoid suicide, 6 marriages that I've kept from divorce,
Oh, good.
13 promotions or career advancements or businesses that have hit record sales months,
Mhm.
dozens and dozens and dozens of guys who I've helped get fix their dating lives and get into relationships with their ideal partners, and some women as well, and a whole bunch of other miscellaneous results that I've been able to do for people. And none of that would have been possible if it weren't for this story, because a big thing that causes people to want to work with me is this story of resilience and overcoming these things. And when they see that I climbed out of that hole, and I guess we'll circle back to the hole in a sec. But
Mhm.
when people see, when you're in that hole, it can look very, very dark. And if you've tried to get yourself out before, and you've tried all the traditional solutions that everyone tells you, right? Oh, read some books, watch some YouTube, meditate, do therapy, think positive, right? You do all the tropes. And if you've tried all those and none of those worked for you, the same way that none of them worked for me and none of them work for the clients I work with, it can seem dark and hopeless, and you can seem like there's no way out. And ending your own life, especially as a man, can very much feel like a very reasonable way out in those circumstances. And I've been there, and it's scary. And so, the reason I'm grateful for everything that happened to me is because I was able to climb out of it and find an unconventional path out of it that I've been able to replicate for dozens and dozens and dozens of other people. And when people see that there's hope, and it just takes that little glimmer of hope, that little light at the end of the tunnel to see there may be a way out, it's unbelievably powerful for the human spirit. And so, given everything that happened, like, I don't regret any of it. I don't have any resentment towards any of it. And I'm grateful for it
Okay,
because,
so let's get
yeah,
back to, so how did you get out of the hole?
when I was in the hole, I tried all the typical things, right? I tried that therapy. I went through probably a dozen or so different therapists. Um, and, I found that there's only so much talking you can do about a problem without solving it. And additionally, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this too. And because just given your work, it makes sense is that, if you keep going back and talking about the problem and talking about the bad thing that happened and talking about how bad you feel about it, all you're really doing is reactivating those cortisol
Yes,
circuits.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
you're strengthening those pathways. So I actually personally found therapy to be very, very counterproductive as far as actually moving forward from these things, because I can't think of a worse thing to do for your healing than to focus on what's going wrong and focus on all the bad feelings. Like, I can't think of a worse thing to do if you're trying to actually feel better.
Yeah,
So I,
so let me answer that now, because people listening may be therapists and they may
yes,
wonder. So, and this is in my new book, Why You're Unhappy, which is coming out in January. So ideally, every responsible therapist doesn't want you to just rehash your pain. They want you to gain perspective on it so that you can move toward your next step. Now, Sigmund Freud, that's where my new book starts. Like Sigmund Freud and a lot of past therapies helped us see this, what's called catharsis, like that recognizing your old pain is a good way to get started because you see sort of how you've created it in your mind. So I think it's valuable, but it's only the first step. And then you have to move on from there. But therapy ends up often being this just dwelling on the old pain rather than moving to the next step. And what's the reason for that? The way I explain it in my new book is it's the politics of the human temptation to quit therapy as soon as there's pressure to go on to the next step. And so they are supposed to empathize with you and help you feel your pain. Some people believe the pain will disappear once you feel it, but others believe that you will, once you feel it, you will want to move on, but they're afraid to push you to move on because then they think you'll quit therapy. So for all these reasons, so I don't know if you're aware, like, was your therapist giving you like little pushes to take that next step? And again, from the animal perspective, the next step is the only thing that triggers happy chemicals because that's how our brain works. It's the action to meet needs that triggers happy chemicals. So if you weren't taking that action, yeah, I'm wondering, like, I remember being in therapy and like if the therapist suggests something and then you're sort of defensive or resentful, but then there's also sometimes therapists who don't even push it at all. So what was your experience?
yeah, my experience was overwhelmingly no action steps. It was a lot of talk and a lot of like, all right, try to keep your chin up, keep going. And a lot of it, I even asked them, I'm like, hey, is there like an end to this? Like, is there an outcome? And a lot of them were like, no, we just, you just keep coming back and doing this over and over. And I'm like, that's not very helpful. So, to your, so that's kind of what I realized was missing from a lot of the processes. And, I know there's some great ones out there. I know there's some great therapists out there. And I more respect to the ones that really, really drive on getting results. My experience and a lot of the clients and people I work with have been with therapists that don't really know anything about moving forward and getting results and just that, talk about it. So that was kind of the thing that I realized was missing. I'm like, okay, what do I do? Right? We talked about it. Great. Like, what do I actually do? And it's like, oh, there was never really clear action steps
Well,
on.
but what the idea is, there's you're supposed to bring up the action steps and then they help you talk about your feelings about the action steps, but they never brought up so it was like nobody, you or the therapist, never brought up like what's next, where do you go next?
I think it was always a lot of that, like kind of what to do next. But it was, I think a lot of it from my memory of it was kind of asking that question, like, what are you going to do next? And it's like, I don't know, like how do I answer that question? Right? Where do I like, yeah, I could do anything next, but I don't even know what to do next. And so I think a lot of it was, there was never like a process, right? I think that was the big thing that was missing from, at least from my experience,
Okay.
was a process for figuring out what is next? Where do I want to go? Where do I actually, with all the infinite options in the world, where do I want to go? So that was a need that I recognized. I recognized that that was a hole in the system.